What we have for you for the next hour and a half or so is talking about the business meeting for MSGERC. And in that, we're going to do a couple things. I'm going to talk about the state of the mycosis study group. Pete is going to talk about the scientific committee report about the studies they're on, and GR is actually going to talk on an educational committee report. And finally, Marissa Maselli will come up and give a Lifetime Achievement Award to Carol Kaufman. So I'm going to get started to try to keep us on time. I apologize, not apologize, but when I started to do this and I made out the schedule, they kind of took me off. They wanted me to talk about guidelines, and I eventually just got wiped out of the program, which is probably okay. But I was just ornery enough that I said, well, maybe during my state of the art, I can make a couple statements about guidelines. That's always dangerous because I suspect there'll be all kinds of issues around them. But I thought it would be the least important. Pete really wanted me to talk about guidelines for a long time. And so I kind of inserted them in here. They are not necessarily part of the state of the MSG. It's just my opinions of guidelines. So with that as a background, let's see if we can get started. One thing I want to emphasize, I can't say enough and appreciative enough, these meetings don't happen without sponsorship. We're not a super rich society and stuff like that. We do what we do with what we've got. But if it wasn't for people that sponsored us, this wouldn't happen. And so I just want to give through the thing another shout out to the sponsors. As you see Estella's here as a diamond level sponsor, a platinum sponsor for the MSG itself, sponsored itself. That's good. They're all in. We're all in. Thanks, MSG. Maine Pharma and Synexis as platinum level. The gold level, Zotera and F2G. And you can see our gold level sponsors, Eurofins, Gilead, ME, Matinas, Macovia, Pearl, Fungal, Exhibitors Carius, Miravista, and Aptly, which is now Pfizer. I want to put those things up there because, again, like I say, for all the sponsorships, I'm so appreciative of it, and the MSG is also. So I want to go on and tell you a little bit about the mission. Actually, I've watched the MSG since, as Pete said, back with Bill Desmuke, so I was a very junior person in some of the meetings they had in Bethesda. They were doing clinical trials, and it kept going on. Eventually, NIAID lost interest, and then they kept it going. Bill kept it going, and then Pete took it over. I really want to say that this was a labor of love for a lot of the people, including the people at Alabama, to keep the MSG going on. Not just what was, and it's not just, but clinical trials and stuff. This thing has morphed. Our mission is to be a resource for the development, conduct, and interpretation of innovative investigation in clinical mycology, to provide effective live and enduring education in clinical mycology, to promote the development of the new generation of practitioners and investigators in this field, and promote advocacy for the profession and to patient populations. It's a big story that we try to cover from those times in which we still do a lot of clinical trials and expertise to education. And I'd just like to say, again, as you see the state that I'm talking about, I think it's made incredible progress. There's a series of people like Pete that started this thing, is committed to it. Carolyn Jones, I just can't say enough about, puts it all together. I will tell you there's no question that about every 2 to 3 months there's a meeting. And a lot of people do show up for those meetings. And so it's connected. It's trying really hard to make a difference in the mycology community. And I was proud to just be sitting kind of part of that doing all my Zoom meetings and stuff like that. But all of these things that are up here, all the things trying to make an impact, it's trying to morph itself. And I think you coming here to see this, you that are members, and the people trying to lead this thing should be proud that they're trying to make a difference. And I actually think they are. And what I've seen in the last 2 to 3 years has impressed me significantly. This is the organizational structure, the board, executive director, as I said, that Carolyn is just outstanding at this. She really knows what she's doing. And with the limited budget we have to have a lot of workers to do these things. And Caslin has been very good for us to kind of help us. And I think Debbie has also been very, very helpful to us from Caslin doing these things. And I'll come back to her in a little bit. The structure is the scientific committee, which you'll hear from Pete. I think it's robust. It's doing things. There are clinical trials going on and various types of things. I think advocacy, we try very hard. The webinars, the Twitters, et cetera, we're working on that. The education. Wait till you hear the stories that GR is going to talk about. I think we're pretty robust on that. Like I say, this meeting had a whole mess more material than I initially thought about, and we ended up making 3 webinars out of it. And adapting to the COVID situation, I think and pivoting was absolutely incredible. The other things of the looking at the individuals like Dr. Fungus, we captured that. They got that kind of website and stuff like that, which is, I think, really, really dramatic to be able to have that kind of presence and that kind of brand to kind of build that, because that is some of the future of getting out into the community. We have a series of ad hoc committees, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. The biennial meeting. Well, all I can tell you is we tried really hard for about 1.5 years to try to get this meeting to happen. It was extraordinarily important to us that we met one-on-one. The networking, the face-to-face was absolutely critical to us. And fortunately, they let us kind of go down the line until we could get it done here this week. But there was a lot of stuff that went into that. We do DRCs. We have study publications that are going on. Social media we talked about, webinars. So there's a lot of little things going on, and they seem to be making progress. I would say over the last 2 years, if anything, they have actually grown. This is the current board of directors, and as you see up there, with the new president that will come on tomorrow. I'll give him the gavel. Louis sits right here, and it'll be all his. And Demetrius is coming on as the president-elect. You can see the board members that we have, the previous board members that were there. I can say again, for me, they were always there. They came to the meetings. I mean, maybe there were some people that missed and stuff like that sometimes, but in general, there was a definite quorum on that. And I can't say enough about that, as I said about Carolyn and her leadership too, along with Pete's. Okay, this is the newly elected. This is the new people coming on. You can see Louis here and Demetrius, and Elon Swartz is going to be our new secretary. The new members to the at-large are John Badley, Monica, GR, and Hong Nguyen. So that's a new group coming on. There's a little bit of foreign ability here. This is also becoming more gender neutral. These are all very outstanding people that I'm sure will end up moving the MSG where it needs to go. I want to say thanks to Pete as past president. His stamp on this is unbelievable. It's not going to change that much, really. He's coming off as the past president. He's always jumped in for anything that I've asked for him, and he'll be on with the executive or with the research committee and stuff like that. So he's not going to go away. Bart, John, and Oliver are coming off. But I would like to say again, they've been solid performers for us. Oliver's been very, very helpful to us and given perspectives from Europe, and is also ECMM connections. So I want to thank them for their work. So the MSG, it's 163 members strong. You can see the cost of the membership. We put up one time what you get from that membership, and I think it's worthwhile. And the current ID fellows can be less. There's going to be big emphasis, I think a big emphasis going forward on trying to maybe have new committees, have things like young MSG committee to try to bring on younger people with some power and some structure at the leadership level. This is important for us, not only as being to be relevant, but also legacy and continue to have this thing continue to progress for the years. And so we had a board meeting 2 days ago, and I think there was a lot of consensus to have another committee for that. You can see here the MSG Committee Coordinating Center is at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and Rachel and Dosti have been the people that are kind of the people on the ground to get all these clinical studies done and get them adjudicated. And as I said, Carolyn is the person that's been over this thing for quite a few years and gives great insight into a lot of different areas. And we do, as I would for both Pete and for Carolyn, I'd like a hand for them because they really make a difference. Well, like I say, I think that financially, I thought I had one slide that I didn't make these slides up. Now I've made up the next slides, but I had made up the other slides. I think what I'd say is financially, I thought there was one slide there. We are not rich, but we're not poor. I think we'll be able to take care of this meeting, and we'll try to grow further from this thing to have other initiatives, including the young people having their say in this. I think also on publications and trying to find out where we should be besides just doing clinical studies, which is absolutely fine and core to what we do, but also the education issues and how we deal with that needs to be kind of more streamlined and maybe more people added and interacting. And I would just like to say, be a member, be part of this thing. If there's things that you want to do and stuff like that, I don't think in any way, shape, or form anybody's going to inhibit you to come to these meetings, to bring these things up, to actually talk about things that we maybe should be doing. I'm not saying we're going to do everything that you want to do, but be involved. This is a forum. This is a group, and their primary mission, you just saw what it was research, education, and clinical practice. And that's what it's for, a labor of love. Now, I'm going to spend the last few minutes on something maybe a little bit more controversial. I said maybe there will be a publication committee, maybe for just not only papers that we can bring out, white papers, et cetera, or clinical studies and the follow-ups on them. But Pete had asked me, well, it's now about 2.5 years ago, when I put together this biennial meeting, and he says, you got to talk about guidelines. I said, well, okay. I'm not going to say no, but then, as I mentioned, over time, it just kind of got whittled down to, they just eliminated me. And I says, okay, that's fine too. I don't need to talk. But then they said, you better talk. And I said, well, I don't want to change anybody else's speaking and stuff like that. So I'm doing this presidential address. I'm not very good at them, and I got to do another in a week and a half at Isham, and it's going to be even worse. But I like that one. I was going to put some science in it. This one I thought I'd put a little controversy in it, or at least some issues that push the envelope a little bit, and talk about fungal guidelines and issues in the literature. So I was doing this, and I said, well, what am I really going to say? Do we have enough fungal guidelines? I don't know. I did something where I just went to PubMed. I'm not great on computers and various things. I do great on email, but websites I ever get a hold of. Twitter, it's impossible, but I'll try. But I did go to my PubMed thing, and I was looking down and said, well, how many hits we got here? Let's find it out. And so the fungal guidelines, if I just hit fungal guidelines up there were 18,000 hits. Well, that seems like a lot. Then I had Carolyn come back and look at my data and stuff like that. He says, I don't know where you got that from. She says, I had about 130,000. I says, well, I went back and checked it. My computer said the same thing, 18,000 hits. So fungal treatment guidelines, if I want to be a little more specific, 7,460 hits. Diagnostics, fungal diagnostics, 10,000 hits. And fungal management, 5,000, 6,000 hits. Karen says, you can't do that. You got to just show over time what's happened. So she put this little graph up there on my slide. I'm not even sure what the X and Y axes are, but I think it's going up. And so I think it started in 1992, and it's up to 2022, and that thing is going up and up. But just don't ask me exactly what's on that y-axis. I'm not sure how much that is. But the point is, when I do all these things, that the guidelines in some way, shape, or form are out there in some way from every society, et cetera, et cetera. And the question is, does MSG need to be part of this plethora of data? Well, the other way that I know that it's kind of important on these things, on guidelines and various things, is the digital situation with guidelines. When I first did and was asked to do up-to-date chapters, I did them all in a weekend, and I just got rid of them. I did them as a favor for somebody, and I did them pretty fast, because I didn't really know what up-to-date was, and they asked me to do it, and so one of the hard words I have to say is no, so off I went and did them. Little did I know at that time really what the impact was and stuff like that. To today, I was just looking the other day, 2021, they said, oh, your chapter on crypto, non-AIDS, non-transplant had 50,000 hits last year. I'm not sure everybody had read that thing. They may have made a mistake when they hit that one. Who knows? But somebody's looking at these things, and UpToDate is an unbelievably powerful place. Wherever you're at. And so, you're dealing with that thing where people make money off this thing. And the UpToDate, I hate to say it, the other thing, I had no idea when I did the UpToDate that I even got any money out of this thing. And then one day, a royalty check showed up. And then after that, my wife says, when's the next one coming? And so she waits on those royalty checks. So, but they make a lot of money off UpToDate. And so they have people and editors and stuff like that work on this stuff a lot. Does MSG have that kind of resources to kind of give that up-to-date type information? I don't know. So I thought I'd give a statement about my exposure to leading guidelines. Did one in IDSA in 2010. I suggested a couple years ago they needed to update IDSA, and I would help them with it, and they said, nah, we don't need your help, you're too conflicted. And I says, okay, fine. ECMM did not say that. I can tell you that I've lost a lot of sleep off these crypto guidelines. As Oliver knows in here, it's been a 3-year labor of love through COVID and everything else. This is not an easy thing to do. I will tell you, all 100 and some pages of it is pretty much done. It's coming to the end. But what I would say up there, in the opinion things, is guidelines are a lot of work, and somebody's got to do it. You can put a whole mess of people on it, but somebody's got to do it. Without substantial infrastructure, a final product can take a long, long time. So if MSG is going to do this thing, getting guidelines, they better be prepared with an infrastructure that can actually help them. The next thing I noticed is the guidelines are static. That's why UpToDate's a little bit good, because you can kind of interact with them. They get back to me every so often and say, oh, gosh darn, that chapter needs this in, that needs it. And then it goes off to Carol Kaufman, and she edits my grammar and puts it back in and stuff like that. So, you just got to go with it. But it's a dynamic situation, and so is clinical practice. And so guidelines sometimes can get out of date by the time they're actually put out there. The other thing I've noticed over time with guidelines is it is a balance between data, which a lot of times is lacking, and opinions. And you get so enwrapped in what you do and what you think, and then you got to say it's a big world out there, and you got to look at those guidelines and interpret them and try to put them into context to what patient population or what geographical area you're actually talking about. The other thing I've noticed over time is no patient, or at least very few patients, actually ever read the guidelines. Maybe the lawyers do, but it's hard to make the guidelines for everything. You just got to put a flag in the sand type of thing. Sometimes that's hard to do to get it just right. The guidelines also have to be important in the sense that they got to be either local, regional, national, or international. Perspective is important, and it has to decide where does MSGERC fit into those perspectives. Does it want to be a regional? Does it want to be an international? Does it want to be a local? Does it want to be a national? I don't know. Where should MSGERC fit into the guideline scheme? What does it really want to do? So I got to thinking about it. And maybe we should be in the guidelines. What we're doing here tonight is kind of a business meeting, so I don't have all the answers to this. And at the time, you can get up afterwards and say, well, Dr. Perfect, you wasted your time with that, or we need to do these tomorrow, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. But what I did was I thought about questions and said, well, does it need to be in the business of guidelines? Does it really want to go all in or not? Maybe. And maybe we'll get a committee together, and maybe that publication committee will say guidelines is going to be part of that. But if we should not respond to the guidelines or parts of them with controversy, maybe we really need to be a guidelines light. In other words, we look at white papers or opinion pieces. There are little things that the guidelines have that may need to be tweaked by experts and people with experience. Not just the data that comes out, but actually the interpretation of that data. And so maybe that's where we need to be, going in and finding areas that we need to give information to that helps society or helps other places. You say, well, that's good, Dr. Perfect. What do you mean by that? Well, I thought I'd do something to say, well, I'll give you some examples of what I could see as guidelines light, things that you could actually maybe tackle as a society and stuff like that. And there was 3 of them I just thought of quickly, but today I was listening through all the things, and yesterday I can see a whole mess of other places where we could actually get into, if people want the energy, to actually get into and talk about guidelines and the interpretations and the rights and wrongs of that. But the 3 I thought about when I started to do this was the eye exams in patients with Candidemia. Whoa, let's come back to that in a minute. The second thing is cryptococcal induction strategies, the ambition study versus Vanderhorst and the ACTG et al. Study of the Vanderhorst study. And I'll spend just a couple minutes on that, on the controversies of that and where we should go on that. And then finally, I'm kind of tired of it. PCR sequencing and Aspergillosis infections. The Europeans, I think, have been doing this for a long time. It's like a struggle to figure out how in the world we ever get any PCRs done for Aspergillosis. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So these are little 3 examples of how one could tackle the guidelines and come up with position papers that might amplify, either correct or amplify strategies and things that actually we should or should not do. So if I look at it and I look at the guidelines, the eye exam for Candidemia, the IDSA guidelines say that all patients with Candidemia should have a dilated retinal examination, preferably performed by an ophthalmologist within the first week. I think that was right. I wrote it down. Hopefully I wrote it down wrong. It's a strong recommendation, low quality. And for neutropenia patients, it is recommended to delay until the neutrophils come back. Well, this has made a lot of ophthalmologists really unhappy. They lose a lot of money off this thing. They got to come up to ICUs where they don't have their fancy equipment that's kind of bolted down in their ophthalmology places. And the American Academy of Ophthalmology recommendations on screening for Candida endophthalmitis came out. It does not recommend a routine ophthalmological exam after Candidemia Only a consult is a patient with signs and symptoms of ocular disease with Candidemia. Okay, so that's a challenge. You want to have a debate on it. We're going to have debates and stuff like that. Does a place like MSG want to come out and talk about this thing, the pros and cons? I'm not even telling you what's right or wrong, but should they really get out there and make statements on it? Actually, I saw recently, which was kind of shocking to me. No, it wasn't shocking to me. It was, somebody did a survey of 100 infectious disease physicians. And one of the questions they asked was, should you do an eye examination on all patients with Candidemia? What percent of those ID physicians said yes? You're thinking, you're trying to say, which way did they go? Actually, 94% of the infectious disease physicians in this country said an eye examination should be done in patients with Candidemia, no matter what their signs or symptoms were. Right alongside the IDSA guidelines for Candida infections. And that the people that are actually going to do the examinations said, no way, we're not going to do it. So I challenge you to think about if MSG wants to do these things, they could challenge themselves by going into guidelines, taking some of these questions, and actually amplifying on it in kind of white paper. Maybe that's something you could get done with a committee, et cetera, et cetera. The second one that I've lost a lot of sleep on over time in guidelines, and just finishing up the ECMM guidelines, all 100 and some pages of it. This is not easy. The induction therapy for cryptococcal meningitis, which one? And what we're talking about is what was talked about that Tom did and David, and they've worked on this for a long time with the Ambition study. Look, I came from a situation where our animal models suggested that intermittent doses or single doses of ambisone would actually work in cryptococcal meningitis in humans because it worked in rabbits, our rabbits. But on the other hand, it's tricky. It's tricky about, as we talked about, geographical areas and practices and stuff like that are different. Now you can come back and say, whoa, this is an interesting thing. This has turned the research-rich people on their head because the research-poor areas or limited areas are telling you what to do. Maybe so. They have the patience. They have the proper studies. So the question comes up is, should this be a recommendation for research-rich places? And where do you put that? If you actually look at those two groups, if you look at them, you do all your little grading, which again, whew, boy, I'm glad I don't have to grade anymore. I'm glad I don't get grades. Well, maybe I do, but boy, oh boy, that grading system bothers me a little bit. But, and you look at it and you say, well, that one on the right side, that single dose ambisone, that's an A1. Wow, that sounds like it's pretty good. Actually, the one on the other side, the one we actually do most of the time in this country, is an A2. Because it doesn't have any randomized control study that's used ambisone and flucytosine together. We used amphotericin B and flucytosine. You have to call it A2. On the other hand, you look at these things, and you got to start thinking about these things, and it's not as easy as Tom was pushed a little bit by Elon and people like that. This is not easy. When you look at these things, resource-rich versus resource-poor, should the guidelines be adapted to wherever they're at? Those EFAs, that's happening in human beings, whether that's in Dar es Salaam or whether that's in Durham, North Carolina. Hardcore data. The other thing that's hard to predict and stuff like that a little bit is their mortality rate was still 25%. Is that what we see here? Well, you go back to the Charlie Vanderhorst study in 1997, and I came up and I said, well, when they looked at the 10-week mortality, it was 9%. And Tom Harrison says, you didn't read that thing well. Charlie and those guys, when they did that thing, after 2 weeks, if they didn't have the patient around, they just left them out of it. They just censored it away. Those patients, if they actually failed, that didn't make it to the 2 weeks, it would be 23% mortality. Okay, I didn't read them well. They just said 9%, and I took it as that. But then I went back to look at some of this big data and stuff like that you got today, and you actually look at that, and it's pretty consistent. These are 30,000 patients over time, and the mortality rate in the U.S. is probably about 10%, give or take 1 or 2% here. And those are at least 2 big studies that showed like about the exact same mortality rate. This is why when you write an NIH grant, you never do those type of studies. You always do the ones that have the 50 and 75% mortality. When you really look down at your group, it's not maybe as high as you think. There's a recent study out of Japan that actually did ambisone and flucytosine. Mortality rate of 150 or some patients, 6%. Okay, maybe if we did the intermittent dosing, the single dosing and stuff like that, we might be at 6%. We have other types of peripheral things that can support these patients. But the truth of the matter is we don't actually have that. The other thing is hospitalizations become very tricky here in the States and stuff like that. If you're not given an IV something or other, you're out of the hospital. And one of the risky factors you can do is to give somebody out of the hospital in induction therapy in at least the first 7 to 14 days. It can get very, very messy. On the other hand, it still may work fine. And what if we do that type of thing and put it up there? That's HIV patients, right? But in the United States, we have probably at least half our patients or more are not HIV anymore. And I just got to thinking the other day when I had a patient with liver disease, with cirrhosis, with disseminated crypto. And I go, wow, I don't know. 1 dose of ambisone would have been okay, but I don't know about that flucytosine and fluconazole at 1,200 milligrams, exactly how that liver is going to hold up. And those are the kind of patients that we actually see. And the drug interactions that we have in the polypharmacies is not something you might see in sub-Saharan Africa. The important point to these things is it's not absolutely clear how we should do it. I will tell you, I guess I can't tell you yet because I haven't got the final approval from everybody, but we have been pretty accommodated in the ECMM, is that we put the data out there and then the places have to decide how they want to do it. But I think whenever you do this thing, you need to have both sides of the story. You need to talk through one side versus the other side. Because in fact, as I said, it's embarrassing that we really have very little randomized studies of cryptococcal disease in resource-rich places in the last 25 to 30 years. And in fact, we did a protocol that's now at A2 that was never studied in any randomized studies. It's just, we adapted it because we needed less toxicity with the ambisome. Okay, and then the final thing, as I was saying with the IDSA guidelines, was for aspergillosis. What is the diagnostic value of nucleic acid testing for Aspergillosis in clinical specimens? And I guess this got me going a little bit because, I don't know, the recommendations down there said, oh, one group favored recommendations for PCR testing. And another group thought that PCR testing is promising, but could not be recommended for routine use in clinical practice. Final conclusion. When PCR assays are used, results should be considered in conjunction with other diagnostic tests in clinical context. Yep, that's the way with all these tests. It's not startling here. But that's not getting us any farther down the line, and I think we need to push a little harder to make some statements about this thing, about what we should be doing. It is incredible to me that I ordered from Viacor 2 months ago a PCR from a BAL, which I couldn't tell whether the patient had Aspergillus or Candida. Excuse me, I could do that. But Aspergillus and Mucor. I wasn't sure, it was tricky, and cultures are negative and stuff like that. And they came back and said, well, Dr. Perfect, they got that test, they can do the PCR. It even throws in nocardia for you. What a great test. I called the company, I says, have you validated this test? Not so much, but you can order it, and I ordered it, and it came back, and it was Aspergillus, and I was a happy camper, and no more concern about voriconazole and Mucor and all that stuff. But then the clinical lab just got all over my case and said, you can't do that. How'd you get away with that? There's no validation in those tests. It's unacceptable to me that in this country, something like Aspergillus, and we still don't have a test with PCR, when in fact, we got a whole system of patients validated that can be FDA approved. There's 180 patients, as Hong talked to us about yesterday, that you can go right in there and you can validate your PCR reaction. in a couple weeks. Why don't we do that? Anyway, if Europe has taught us anything, if we taught anything, maybe we should be pushing a little harder on some of the diagnostic tests we have. Maybe we don't have to be the person doing again, whether voriconazole is used or whether ambazone's used or whether isavuconazole is used. We got to tweak some of these things and start talking about them. So, in the end, should the MSG be in the guideline business? Well, I read to you the mission statement, which we again went over in the last year to try to clean up. And the mission statement is research, scholarship, mentoring, education, advocacy. Well, surely the guidelines fall under those missions in some way, shape, or form. So I think it is something that we thought about could be in our wheelhouse. Many societies and groups do guidelines. Space is crowded and it's labor intensive. So if you're going to do it, go in all in. It's going to take some time and some effort. Some guideline areas are clear and unambiguous. I don't know, to repeat them again, is that worth anything? I don't know, maybe it helps our brand in some ways. But I think there are other tweaks that we could actually do better where we went in and took certain controversial areas that are not that clear. And maybe we still can't make them clear because you need more data. But we can actually look at all the pros and cons, and I think we could be helpful that way. Maybe our best strategy is to identify controversies in guidelines or data deficient zones. That's always tricky. And make these sections clear and provide insights into clinical context. I'm not thinking that we should turn our backs on guidelines. I think we should try to figure out what we really want to do and what we really want to say. I would suggest, and again, tomorrow I'll give the gavel to Lewis, and I'll ride off in the sunset, except I'll be the past president, still on the board of directors for another 2 years. But I would recommend the idea of thinking about these things in a publication kind of committee or recreating these things, that may be a formation of a guidelines adjudication committee. And I hate to say this because I could do this and then I can say, oh, well, so what? We got 10 more committees that don't do anything. But I think it's true that if we want to be in that guideline business, we should have people that are dedicated to this thing that could really tweak these things and really make them relevant. So in summary, the MSGERC is in a crossroad when it comes to guidelines, I think. You either jump into the guideline business or you don't. You take a limited approach in which controversial sections are adjudicated and discussed. Just be the status quo. You can just keep on doing what we're doing, talking about it again the next year, and let others do the guidelines or do another strategy. Remember, who is our audience? Why do you want to intervene? Where is it most cost-effective to tackle the recommendations? And when do you have a voice that needs to be heard? All those things we have to ask ourselves if we're going to go into this business. The W's need to be answered by the MSGERC. Can a committee do that? And should we do that? I leave it to the people going forward. I leave it to you on any comments on this thing after we're done. You can talk to me, talk to Lewis, talk to the board, what you think we should be doing with the guidelines. I do not say that I have the answer to that. I don't think we can duck our head and say the status quo, but exactly how it's done needs to be very carefully done, and look at the W's and say what makes sense for us. Okay, so that's enough, and I guess at the end we can have a discussion on these things if you would like.